There's growing interest in sending NATO troops to Ukraine. That said, I would not be holding my breath right now. Now let's talk about what happened here, because first, Slovakian PM Robert Fico stated that some NATO leaders had been considering sending NATO troops to Ukraine. However, at the same time, other NATO leaders had been stating that it was completely off the table. Then, however, in a meeting in Paris with 20 other European leaders, French President Emmanuel Macron said, quote, "There is no consensus at this stage to send troops on the ground. Nothing should be excluded. We will be doing everything that we must so that Russia does not win." And he would go on to reiterate that Ukraine should win the war and Russia should not be allowed to win. And I'm thinking, whoa, what the heck, right? And he did not provide any further information after that. Obviously, this began to cause a heated debate amongst other NATO leaders. German Prime Minister Olaf Scholz, which quite on brand, denied and said that there would be no European boots in Ukraine. Now that's a lot of kind of back and forth statements that we're getting right now from some of the different European leaders here. Russia on brand also said that they would go to war with NATO if any NATO troops ended up in Ukraine. And even after all of this, Macron has not backtracked at all. He's kind of tried to, it appears, kind of regain some element of strategic ambiguity with regards to Ukraine. You'll note that, as an example, right, with Taiwan, there's strategic ambiguity on whether or not the United States will get involved in a war over Taiwan. And that's really designed as a deterrent where China is kind of unsure if they go to war over Taiwan, that they will have to also face off against the United States, which is obviously a huge difference between just facing off against Taiwan by itself. In this case, there has not been much strategic ambiguity over Ukraine up to this point. Obviously, a lot of NATO countries have been sending all kinds of lethal aid and non-lethal and monetary support for the Ukrainians since the war began. There's also been very clear messaging that NATO has limits. It's not going to send some weapon systems only, within a year or over a year later, those systems somehow, end up in Ukraine. They've also been very clear that boots will not go on the ground and NATO troops will not be fighting Russia in this conflict. And I'm still kind of holding to that, but we'll kind of discuss more of that here in a second. I think clearly there's a bit of a wild story. It kind of takes us a little bit out of where we've been previously in this conflict, where this is a Russia-Ukraine war. And while NATO and NATO countries are supporting Ukraine, it's not, a NATO-Russia fight. But I want to kind of dive into some of these questions that we might, have. No, the deployment of NATO troops to Ukraine does not mean that the deploying country can invoke Article 5 if their troops get attacked. This kind of deployment would be an expeditionary deployment, meaning that it's outside of the framework of a defensive alliance. It's an optional deployment for the deploying country, like say France sends troops. They're doing so on their own accord, and it would be a bilateral agreement. And this actually kind of reinforces what the Slovakian PM had kind of described a little bit. He kind of described bilateral agreements between NATO countries and Ukraine. Again, in this case, it just happens that some of the countries are in NATO, but it is not a NATO action, if that makes sense. And no, I don't think we're about to see NATO troops in Ukraine. Honestly, I'm kind of unconvinced that this isn't, kind of like I said, an attempt to recover some element of strategic ambiguity over Ukraine. We've kind of seen a lot of that kind of disappear. A lot of the messaging out of Europe has been very clear, right? These are the limits that NATO is going to operate in, and it's not going to exceed outside that point. And so Russia can kind of expect, okay, well, we should expect what happens within the limits from NATO allies in Ukraine, the kinds of support that they're going to give Ukraine, but we should not expect them to exceed those limits. Of course, that doesn't do you much good in terms of strategic ambiguity, because there is no ambiguity whatsoever, right? And so I think France is kind of trying to recover some of that right now, but it's really hard to do that, right, whenever your hand doesn't know what your foot is doing. And I'm kind of referring to Olaf Scholz, right? Because Emmanuel Macron is trying to recover, at least appearingly trying to recover some strategic ambiguity, but Scholz is kind of over on his end, like, what are you doing? Like it's like he's not even in the huddle. Like he's not on the same page with Macron right now. And so it's kind of making the whole situation kind of strange. Of course, maybe Macron's having their own conversations with Ukraine and Scholz isn't a part of that. Completely possible. But At the same time, if we're talking about NATO as a structure, it'd be better to have more unified messaging from the top. So, we're all kind of on the same page, right? And we're not sending different messages to Russia here. Of course, all of this kind of follows a statement that Germany will not be sending Taurus missiles to Ukraine. The reasoning from Scholz was that German troops had to be involved in the kill chain, which is kind of a silly excuse. In his mind, if Taurus missiles are going to be used, then German troops will have to be involved in the spotting of targets, the acceptance of the fire mission, and the firing of the fire mission, or at least in parts of that kill chain. So you're kind of getting two different, sides of the coin right now, especially with Macron on the other side of the coin, where you have Scholz, he was incredibly risk adverse, and he was trying to be incredibly cautious regarding this conflict. And this has impacted other areas of aid to Ukraine. And then you have Macron, and France has given pretty good support to Ukraine as well. And they've been fairly risk averse as well. But Macron's also just kind of like, listen, maybe we will send troops. Who knows? I'm not sure. Which I don't know if he's trying to go like Pop Goes Punk right now and just kind of go like emo Emmanuel or something right now. But he's sending some messages. And I can imagine in Moscow, it's kind of getting a little awkward and strange. Now, what would a NATO deployment to Ukraine look like? And this is really kind of speculation, but I'm basing this off of the risk tolerance that we've seen out of NATO and kind of how they've handled certain situations in the past. I would not expect that NATO troops would be going any further than the west side of the Dnipro River. They will not be going further east than Kiev. I would imagine they'd be staying far away from the fighting. I'd imagine that they would be there to protect key sites and government sites and really keeping, the government afloat. And that would free up Ukrainian troops that were previously pulling security at those sites to be able to go and fight on the front. I do not think that they would be there to fight for Ukraine. I would be incredibly shocked if they ended up doing any fighting whatsoever, unless it was defensive, unless they get attacked. And maybe I end up getting wrong and they do send, troops, but I hope not. I think that would be fairly escalatory. The closer you put them to the front, the more you risk escalation, even if they're west of the Dnieper River. Like, for instance, what happens if a Russian missile that's targeting a sensitive Ukrainian site that's protected by NATO troops, what if that missile kills NATO troops? What does that country do? How do they respond to that? Do they kind of perceive that as that's just the cost of doing business with having troops in a conflict area? Or do they see that as, Russia has attacked our troops, even though maybe Russia was attacking the Ukrainian target? Would Russia consider NATO equipment and personnel protecting sensitive Ukrainian sites as valid targets and target them as well if the NATO assets are preventing Russia from targeting that Ukrainian site? I think it's hard not to think that, they would consider that. They would consider those NATO assets as valid military targets. Now, this kind of all leads to another question and a final question that really should kind of go with every, I think, big decision. But is this the right thing to do, especially considering the risks? And this is an incredibly difficult question. I think we can all kind of see how this can and would lead to an escalation in the conflict. Could it prevent Russia from achieving its maximum war aims? Remember, considering that Russia, their maximum objectives is the kind of the flipping of the Ukrainian government back to a pro-Russian government. So if the Ukrainian government is really kind of largely held up by NATO troops in country and protected by them, then I think it could kind of prevent Russia from achieving its war aims. But in doing so, could that endanger other countries to forms of escalation that we've luckily so far not had to see so far in this conflict? Yeah, possibly. I think so. Now, I'm going to ask another question. I'm totally ripping this off of Zero Dark 30. What is the cost of not doing something? And is it right to do nothing? Personally, I don't think so in this case, but I'm going to leave that to you. So comment your thoughts below on this. Again, I've seen a lot of people kind of freak out about this. At the same time, I'm not putting much weight in these statements. I think it's posturing. I think that, of course, Russia has to say, listen, you put troops in Ukraine, we're going to go to war. But I don't think anybody wants war. Nobody wants war. I think, we'll see what ends up happening. Maybe I end up wrong. I hope not. But anyway, I want to get your thoughts on this. This is a pretty interesting topic, and we'll talk tomorrow.